Hello, you're listening to Queer Everything, a queer of color podcast about thriving in the world while being at odds with it. I'm Lena Rafiq Sheikh. We have some really exciting conversations to share with you this season. My guest on this episode is Dr. Kareem Khubchandani, Associate Professor at the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies at Tufts University, whom you may know as their drag persona, LaWhore Vagistan. Kareem is the author of Ishtyle, Accenting Gay Indian Nightlife, and has also opened a field of scholarly inquiry called critical auntie studies, and this is why I approached them about coming on the podcast. In addition to being one of the most talented performance artists I have ever seen, I found their work on the overlooked, often transgressive, and ultimately very queer figure of the auntie fascinating. I learned a lot of things in this conversation, from thinking more expansively about performance as research to the mechanics and engineering of drag. It's a pleasure to share this conversation with you. Hi, Kareem. It is so wonderful to have you on the podcast. I've been so excited about talking to you since we first floated the idea. Kareem, you and I have known each other for several years. I think towards the end of my time in grad school, I bumped into you at a presentation on Harvard's campus. And then I got to know you by watching your performances, which are absolutely brilliant. So for people who don't know you, would you introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. So my name is Kareem Khubchandani, and I welcome any pronouns. I am an associate professor at Tufts University, and I teach classes and do research at the intersection of queer studies, gender studies, performance studies, and South Asian diasporic studies. So my research broadly thinks about popular culture, nightlife, drag, film, music, and its relationship to gender and sexuality, how it gives queer and trans people tools to make a more beautiful life for themselves, especially as the world continues to try to foreclose those opportunities to us. I'm also a performer, and I use drag to specifically tell these stories of how people negotiate their relationship to the state and to faith and to work and to pleasure and to their own bodies through lip sync and dance and humor and play. I'm generally interested in spaces of community such as nightlife spaces and drag spaces, but I'm also interested in the importance of aesthetics to making those spaces. So I tend to think a lot about fashion and style along with politics and such. Yeah.
Beautiful. I feel like my experience of Boston nightlife got much more interesting when you moved to the city.
I mean, anything can make Boston's nightlife more interesting because it's pretty
fair enough. The bar is low.
The bar is low.
And you perform in drag, and your drag persona is called LaWhore Vagistan. Please tell us a little bit about that.
So I started doing drag in 2009, and I was living in Chicago, and I was hosting a fundraiser for a small queer South Asian organization that was just forming, and we didn't really know what we were doing, and we're like, let's throw a party, let's have drag. And I couldn't find any other drag artists at that time. And now there's a robust scene there of drag kings and queens and non-binary artists, but then there wasn't. So I got in drag for the first time, and I made up this name that tries to capture some of the complex histories of nation and diaspora that I live with. You know, I grew up in Ghana in a Sindhi merchant community. And so, you know, my relationship is not to India or to Pakistan, but sort of imagined elsewhere that I tried to make up with the idea of LaWhore Vagistan. And for me, you know, my drag is an opportunity to enjoy sexuality. And so LaWhore has a W in the name. And I think that there's really this complexity about we have to be complex in talking about drag right now, because the right wing is insisting that drag is sexual, right? Is inherently sexual. That is a misnomer, but for me in particular, it is sexual, right? But it's a very concerted effort to access a sexuality that I think me and people like me are often denied or exoticized for, and to work with sexuality on my own terms. So anyways, I came up with this name and I started performing, and it was supposed to be a one-off performance, and the fundraiser kept happening, and so I kept performing. But drag has been this way of playing with gender on stage and then off. I bought all this jewelry for LaWhore to wear, but then I would wear it as well. Mm-hmm. And it just made me comfortable shopping in a different aisle in the clothing store. Mm-hmm. It has shifted the way I think about gender and fashion and joy. And the thing about drag that is most important to me is that it's about community. So it's not just about me feeling my fantasy on stage, but it's about creating an experience for the audience as well. And it's that thing that happens between us that I think is most important and beautiful, when people are responding to my performance, people are engaging, people are screaming, people are tipping, people are silent or in awe, or they're bored, right? But it tells me that we're there in the same space together, right? And my ability to see that something is happening between us tells me that there are stories and meaning between all of us that bring us together and hold us together. And that's what makes me keep doing drag.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Yeah, I've personally experienced many times your ability to engage and enthrall or leave in stitches an audience. The first performance that I took my spouse to was, it was a queer of color burlesque show. I forget the name of it. And Kareem, I haven't been able to listen to A Whole New World since. I really haven't. You've changed that song for both of us. And spouse nearly fell off the stool laughing. It was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I think I've ruined that song for a lot of people, which I'm very proud of.
Be proud of it. It's amazing. And I think there was something about that performance in particular, because I think I remember you feeling around on social media for a little bit of inspiration around it, or like asking a few questions before that came out. And I just got to thinking, like, made me realize what a brilliant and engaging performer you are, like as an artist, right? I, went into a place of real respect and awe with you after that in particular, because I don't know, there was something like deeply thoughtful about it. And I also know that there were a lot of gears turning behind the scenes with your performances in general. And I'd be curious to have you talk a little bit about that, because I have the sense that a lot of the way that you show up on stage is also deeply rooted in your scholarly commitments.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right that, I'm a researcher first. And I came to drag through research. I entered these queer South Asian communities because that's what my dissertation project was on. I mean, I was looking for friends and community, but I was also writing about them. And I think critical scholarly research asks you to be rigorous in your approach to making a product. And so when I'm putting together a performance, for hours, I'm Googling sounds and video and costumes, trying to make it work, trying to put together a story, trying to make things fit together. So I think when you saw me, I started with a Hindi version of Frozen, Let It Go, and which, I had never heard before I did that event. But again, deep YouTube hole took me there. But I think, getting lost in the material is one way to get to know what's out there. And then there's the process of imagining, okay, who am I giving this to? And who's the audience for this? And so at this Queer of Color burlesque show, I wanted to insist on the opportunity to hear other languages on stage. I wanted to make sure that there was joy and pleasure and fun and sexuality alongside critique and seriousness. And this is something I write about I write essays about, is what does it mean for scholarship also to be fun? I think that we, as critical scholars who are pointing out the structures of power that surround us, we often create conditions in which we're not allowed to feel good, and the people we write about are not allowed to feel good because everything is so bad. And it is bad. but how do we make space to say otherwise, right? How do we acknowledge that people are having fun despite violent conditions around them? And it's often the people we want to tell the most serious stories about are minoritized people, Black and brown, and folks from not from the US or Europe, queer and trans folks. We're like, everything is so bad for them, for us. And they're also having a great time. And we forget to account for that. And that's definitely where my scholarship and my performance really link together to find some possibility inside of all of the violence around us, all of the structural violence and everyday violence, to have a little respite and joy and pleasure.
I love that. And I appreciate that as an intervention in these spaces and appreciate how you do it so well. I'm curious how it is doing drag in the context of like researching it and also now performing it, as you have been the last year plus, in academic spaces.
I think academic spaces are hungry for a different kind of academic body. I think that the researcher's body, the professor's body, is a highly masculinized white one, right? Our idea of the professor is the tweed jacket with elbow patches, right? And there's barely any professors who look like that, but if you watch a movie, that's who professors look like. Right. But that embodiment of the scholar, the researcher, the teacher is definitely sort of a white masculinized one. And so doing drag in the academy has been this way of insisting upon experimenting with what a kind of messy brown femininity can do in these spaces as well. I'm when I show up to class in drag, which is not often, most once a semester, if at all, but if LaWhore shows up to the classroom instead of me, she is tripping over her sari. My body's not used to moving in the space dressed like that, with that much jewelry and wigs and makeup and whatnot. So it's not this like graceful, powerful femininity. It's a playful, messy one that I think allows students and colleagues to see me differently, right? And to see the space differently. It transforms the space and my students take it really seriously. They will call LaWhore Dr. Vagistan. They will talk about Kareem in third person in those times, so right. It's also teaches me that there's room for play in the classroom, that I think we can mine for its possibilities. And one of the ways I came to doing all this also was I wrote this interview with LaWhore. So I published an interview. It was Kareem interviewing LaWhore about being in the classroom, but it also taught me how to write in a different voice. And so even my writing has been shaped by drag. And so I have this book coming out called Decolonize Drag, but the preface and the introduction and the outroduction, I guess, are written by LaWhore. And so she's given me a writing voice that is more open-ended, less argument-oriented than the kind of scholarly voice that I've been trained in. So, a journal published that interview that I mentioned, right? There's room for play, there's room for drag in the academy. And I'm certainly not the only academic drag artist out there. There are many. We're a small but mighty bunch, I think.
There are more. Okay.
Oh, there certainly are more. Yeah.
I would be so curious to read the interview, the intro, the outro. What you were saying to me about being this brown body asserting itself in a certain way in academia. I mean, I think this is an experience that a lot of people from our part of the world have, including me as a refugee from academic spaces. As you know, I opted out. And I appreciate that there's something transformative and evocative and provocative about just showing up in those spaces. As you know, I also do organizational culture change work, which in the last couple of years has been a lot of diversity work. And so I can't help but wonder about how it feels for you to show up that way in the space and what you feel like you evoke and how that is for you.
So I think I'm very aware that being a brown queer person at a predominantly white institution in the neoliberal academy makes me a token, right? It doesn't matter how my scholarship can be good, my teaching can be good, but just by virtue of my body being here, I'm doing work. And that just shouldn't be the case. That the fact of my presence does work, because that's work that I'm actually not compensated for. And certain students gravitate towards me and ask me for my time and my emotional work and emotional presence and all of those things. And I can be compensated, or my research and my teaching can be acknowledged, but all of that other work doesn't get, no one takes stock of that. Sure. Because, anyways, all of that is to say, when I realize that my body is doing work that is beyond me, what performance steps in to be able to manage and control that, right? And control for that. I'm like, oh, okay, so if my body is the thing that does work, why don't I actually use it, right? Why don't I actually show up in drag, right? And deploy it in a way that allows me to have some fun with it, rather than just being this token, why don't I actually bring attention to the fact that my body is also part of my work, especially in the university where we are sort of relegated to the life of the mind? Why not insist on the fact that I'm doing physical labor by being here in this flesh, and and drag does that by transforming the flesh, right? So when students see me differently in drag, they then have to reckon with the fact that, oh, they see me out of drag too, and they are interpreting my body in a particular way. I'm useful to them in a particular way. And I think that that's really important, that they see me that way, and that they realize that because the statistics are there to tell us that queer and trans people and feminine people and women in the academy are treated differently by students and their colleagues, right? And it may all be subconscious, but it does happen. And so if students are able to see that they are in fact seeing race and gender, I think it becomes really important to changing how they interact with our labor. One of the things that drag has also done for me is, and I think we might talk more about this in a bit, but has led me to the idea of auntie. And in the classroom, I've taken up the position of auntie as this way of protecting myself from giving too much labor, right? Giving too much and giving my whole self to the university and to my work, because it's a reminder that I'm not mother, right? I'm not there to shepherd these young people's futures all the way through, and I don't need to be disappointed when they don't choose me, right? Or they don't, they don't follow my instruction, or they don't pursue the paths that I think are strongest for them. Or I think the auntie as this figure that does her work, but it's on the side and, is often under acknowledged. As someone teaching in interdisciplinary fields, I realized that that's always going to be my position. And so being drag auntie feels like a great place to do my subversive work, but then step back and let people make their choices, and not emotionally invest in a way that then drains me.
I really appreciate that. So doing it on your own terms in a way.
Right.
Yeah. I really appreciate that framing. And I think it's a really powerful way to show up in the way that you want in this setting that does and could ask so much of you, people like us. So the Auntie Studies piece was actually what caught my eye when I was thinking about charting out this season. I mentioned to you that the very thin line that threads through this arc is going to be about family and queering family and queer family. And I appreciate how your way of looking at the auntie who cuts a very queer figure in the way that you write about her, is so delightfully and surprisingly generative. I was reading your intro to a journal volume about critical auntie studies, and I pulled a paragraph about how you say, quote, aunties are women, femme, and queer figures adjacent to or at the periphery of nuclear family formation. The nuclear unit here also stands as a metonym for other boundaried institutions such as the university, corporation, or nation that reproduce heteropatriarchal capitalist ideologies and structures. Auntie can name a biological relation or a generational one, but aunties can just as well be strangers, and so on. I thought this was really brilliant, first of all, the whole introduction was. And I'm curious about how you came to this and how you have come to think about it.
So this is another one of those instances where performance led me to research. I was in a drag competition in Austin, Texas, and our final assignment for the competition was to write a song parody. And I wrote this song parody about Justin Bieber's Sorry called Sorry. And, one of the lines is, you don't want to mess with this auntie. And it pulled together just, improvising those lyrics and coming up with that song and then a music video really pushed me to understand my drag aesthetic as an auntie aesthetic and to think about what big hips and busts and saris and this kind of queer femininity looks like, because you'll see in South Asian popular culture, diasporic and subcontinental, that the auntie is this kind of boisterous, loud, accented figure that appears everywhere. And there's almost no accounts of her. Nobody has sat down to think, or very few people have sat down to think methodically and carefully about who the auntie is and why this term circulates so widely and manages to capture so many different kinds of people, like the person selling vegetables down the street you refer to as auntie, but also your dad's sister you might refer to as auntie, right? And so how can this term be so capacious but also be so concrete in its form, right? That when people saw me in drag, they were like, oh, you're auntie, right? So that led me to some thoughts and questions, and I started seeing a lot of artists playing with the idea of the auntie as well. And so I started looking into auntie figures, and it allowed me to pull together a set of academics who are interested in these kinds of other femininities, right? That are not always tied to good womanhood, that are not always tied to motherhood, and to think about auntie capaciously, not just in a South Asian context, but to develop this first, what was an online symposium, and then a special issue of a journal called Critical Auntie Studies that takes seriously these figures who are at the border of the family or the institution, and who have this ability to either reinforce the boundaries or to open them up, right? By being placed in those positions, So what I was talking about before about being in interdisciplinary fields, right? I'm that boundary figure that says, oh, you have to be a good theater scholar, or, oh, like being an anthropologist is also being a theater scholar. So mess it all up, right? So I think that's the kind of queer work that aunties can do to say, and the very heteronormative work aunties can do. And I think that they can be both. And I think that that's really a really exciting position to think with and study and be inside of as well.
Yeah. There was another line that really resonated for me, a little bit in relation to what you talked about with your students, that said, home is not always a sanctuary for women, queer, and trans folks. And as such, those uncanny figures who infiltrate its borders can be life-giving or life-saving.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the question of home has been a long meditation in queer studies and in queer feminist studies. So I'm thinking about someone like Gloria Anzaldúa who says that she carries home on her back, right? This queer Chicana feminist who says that her biological home, there was violence and heteronormativity enforced inside of the biological home, but also to leave that home and go into other spaces meant leaving language behind, leaving culture behind, right? And so home can be something that we do, right? Home is something that we can create for others. Home is something we can embody, but our natal homes aren't that word home is so warm and caring and loving, but it seems like it, or it should be, but it can actually be spaces of violence and danger or just ambivalence, right? And I think that then looking to these figures who perhaps expand the boundaries of the home or give you a break from it, or who come in and wreck it, right? And create chaos. All of those things I think are really exciting about the auntie. You'll find in a lot of stories, a lot of narratives, that it's the auntie who comes into the house smoking cigarettes and brings sexuality and like brings non-normative sexuality into the home. She's the slutty auntie, the hypersexual auntie, or there's the auntie who just has weird fashions or unexpected fashions that allow the little queer boy to see themselves differently. There's the dance teacher auntie who gives people a different access to their bodies. There's they're just examples upon examples of aunties bringing something different into the home that I think is really exciting, right? Because when we think of the home only as the nuclear family, we're forgetting that boundaried space actually has lots of other figures who can make more of it, right? And create some safety or some escapism even when the home does not feel like the safest place.
You know, the first time I heard about critical auntie studies, it was a few years ago. And I think my relationship to it now has shifted a little bit with age, because I realize I've graduated completely now into auntiedom. And I jokingly call it "don't give a shit auntiedom," because that's definitely accompanied it, caring much less about certain things as a woman my age. You know, what you're saying about this idea of being like a sanctuary and a presence, that, you know, you're also making me think of now my time in academia. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the students who I'm still in communication with tend to be the queer ones, especially the queer they see ones, right?
Yeah.
Even now, 5 years and counting after I've left academia. So if you're open to talking about it, I imagine that there were some early auntie figures that must still come to mind for you as a queer kid growing up.
Oh, I mean, I think it's all of them. You know, it's this sort of collection of women that surrounded my mom that really gave me the opportunity to see what feminine collectivity can do, you know, and they taught me. I mean, I would listen to them talk about questions of domestic violence, emotional abuse, etc. I was a kid. I was 9, 10, 11, sitting in the corner, hearing these stories. And I was listening to them negotiate heteropatriarchy, right? And they didn't call it that. I don't think they would call what they were doing queer, right? But it really taught me that there needs to be an out from this system. And so, I mean, sure, I remember their like very fabulous Versace kaftans and Tory Burch shiny things, and like all of that is there too, you know, and the saris they wore and how much gold was happening around me with them. Like there's all of that. But I think what was really important was also witnessing how they created resources, right? So they gave each other, you know, as wives and mothers, they gave each other resources that the family doesn't hold and the home does not hold. they were a reminder that the home is not a safe place. The home is not lovely and joyful all the time, but that you need these other people to come in and help in all kinds of situations, mundane or urgent.
And I also imagine that you've had auntie type figures in your life in the queer community.
Yeah, there was this gay couple in Central Park who I just went up to when I was fresh off the boat, a week into being in the US, and was like, "Are you gay?" And they like got me resources and whatnot, and they're not in my life anymore, but they were willing to do that work for a stranger, right? To make sure that I was okay. And they were like, here's my number, call me whenever you want, and it's not like, again, they didn't try to mother me, make me theirs, bring me into their fold. They just were like, we know that it's probably difficult for you. Here's an option should you ever need it, right? But then there was also in Chicago, this queer Pakistani immigrant activist named Ifti Naseem who helped me see the South Asian community differently there. He taught me about all the kinds of complexities and problems of the community, of how many leaders and entrepreneurs were closeted that he knew about. But also, it was excellent gossip, but it was also a lesson in thinking our community beyond its sort of heteronormativity, to say there's actually a great amount of sexual and gender diversity here that you may not see unless you're deeply integrated into it. And so, again, someone who wanted to be both a friend and a mentor at the same time, and wanted to make dirty jokes, but also wanted to be respected, and I think that this role of auntie becomes this place to occupy complexity outside of the bounds of normative expectations.
Beautiful. So as we've been talking, a couple questions have come up for me. Now, when you obviously perform as an auntie figure in drag and you teach drag, so I'll lay out the two questions that I'm going to ask you, and I'll edit this bit out later. The one I think I'd like to ask towards the end is how it is to teach your students in this climate. And I imagine it's both life-giving and also fraught in certain ways. And the other question is, since trans rights and stripping them away and, this hysteria around gender is the crowbar issue right now in US politics and other politics, I've had a lot of people ask me the question, like, what is drag? And I sit there and I think, like, it is different things in different places and times to different people, right? And I'm curious whether you've gotten that question and how you would answer it, or what you would direct people to.
Yeah. So I think it can start with the question of what is drag, which I think about as theatrical performances of gender. So for entertainment, for the stage, for public protest, for these theatrical moments, but theatrical performances of gender, usually in LGBTQ spaces, but also beyond, that mobilize the aesthetics of gender for the purposes of politics or storytelling or entertainment or humor, but that it is specifically gender that's being mobilized as theater, as an aesthetic, that's being purposefully put on the body to entertain, to get a laugh, to create a world, to transport us through time. And on those terms, all theater is drag as well, right? So drag can teach us how we're in fact so invested in gender, right? We think of it as everyday, but it in fact is full of aesthetic choice and such. But it is a performance tradition that I think appears in many queer and trans cultures across the world, right? That there is the use of staging the body in particularly loud or bawdy ways to bring attention to the way gender is working and to make fun of it, to reinscribe it, to enjoy it when doing gender and conforming to gender can be so oppressive. What happens when you put it on stage to actually have fun with it purposefully, right? So I think that bounded space of understanding something as performance creates a lot of opportunity to experiment with something that we actually live with every day. And I think we want to understand drag, or we want drag to mean people of one gender performing as another gender. That's what the right wing would have us believe. And even RuPaul's Drag Race wants us to believe that, right? But we have trans women performing as themselves, and using the same name that they live with as their stage name. But again, there's that experience of when you put it on stage, something else can happen. So there's an essay I like to teach and cite that in which Latina trans woman talks about how being on stage in drag allows her to embody her size and her age with more confidence. It allows her to develop an activist voice just by being on the mic and saying these things out loud. And so there are opportunities that being on stage or, being seen and becoming spectacular affords that I think everyday gender doesn't always do. But we have, they're non-binary drag artists and they're, who are not performing male or female on stage, but are mobilizing masculinity and femininity in multiple ways through their performance. So I think we need that capacious language. But I think the theatrical mobilization of gender for pleasure, critique, politics, joy, community is the way that I frame drag. And I know that's still not well defined enough, but that's precisely the point, is that the right wants to define drag, and it's not definable. It is actually a big, messy world that brings together pantomime and burlesque and hijra and koti performance and Thai kathoey performance, right? All of, like, when we go and see a drag show in Thailand, it's actually a mix of multiple genders doing drag, trans women and kathoey and cis men all in the same lineup. So yeah, I think we just need to, and it's the same here in Boston. People of many genders who are all mobilizing gendered aesthetics for a variety of purposes. Or I think what we see in the legislation that is currently out there is a deeply transphobic one, right? That can only understand drag as a person of a certain sex performing a gender that doesn't conform to that assigned sex. And I think it's straightforward transphobia. And it's this disbelief that a body can inhabit a gender that is different from that of its, and not just disbelief, but an active disallowance of embodying gender that is different from that of the assigned sex. It's really very violent, really transphobic. And with the rise of the drag story hour, I think that the proximity between young people and drag artists, if drag was relegated to the nightclub, then maybe it wouldn't be such a problem. But I think drag story hour became this site of attack over the last few years that has now led to conversations around grooming and such that draw on these like older languages of older assumptions about pedophilia of like queer and trans people. And it's really horrific and violent and scary that policy is being used to regulate gender. But again, that's nothing new too. Yeah.
I mean, I have my thoughts about this. What are your thoughts about why now? Like, why in this moment?
I mean, I think because we're always moving towards elections, but I think that it's a way of galvanizing the right wing, that they agree on gender, right? They agree on the gender binary and they believe in the nuclear family, right? This is the power of the nuclear family in politics, right? And this is why the auntie becomes, I think, so valuable to think with, but that the home needs to be kept private from all forms of aunties, right? All these queer figures who could infiltrate it. That children should conform to the formula that their parents occupy, right? Which is heteronormativity, which is the gender binary, right? And it's trying to control exactly those things. And it's a way of galvanizing those people who agree so wholeheartedly that the gender binary is good and that the nuclear family is sacred. And it feels like it's working, and that's really terrifying.
Right.
But I think also why now is because I think young people have also acquired phenomenal language with which to articulate their gender, and it's really scaring people who again are invested in the binary. So it's not just trans, but I think it's all the other language and terms as well. Young people describing themselves as non-binary, or anybody, but especially young people's power with language to say, I'm aro ace, I'm non-binary, I'm transmasculine, any of those things, people are like, oh, I don't understand my children. And it's precisely that, right? It's that desire to control who your child becomes that I think is inciting this fear about a changing generation, or a generation whose genders are just untenable, that I think is producing this. So basically it's a backlash to queer and trans activism, is, I think.
Right. And a disruption of the inevitability of binary thinking.
Yeah.
When you were talking earlier, I was reminded of a time when I interviewed in a university space, and one of the traditions that they had in this space was drag shows. And I was being interviewed by, as far as I could tell, straight people. And they asked, okay, well, what would your drag act be? And I was like, honestly, my drag act would probably be to be really femme. And I lost them in that moment. They had no idea what I was talking about, which I thought was really interesting, because ostensibly this was writ large. It was a queer space, and these folks were being game and like functioning within that. And I thought that was really bizarre, because to me that was a completely valid answer and true to me.
Well, that's the thing, is that there are also so many cis women who perform as drag queens. Yeah. So many. And again, like, this legislation can't capture them. And so, if drag is actually banned anywhere and it's enforced, I'm really hoping that it's cis queens who will actually keep doing drag and hold the scene together, and who can't be punished by those transphobic legislations, but can keep queer aesthetics alive and make room for queer and trans joy because of their access to cis privilege. There's that very possibility, and that'd be really fun and exciting to see them mess with, to do drag story hour, but with cis women. It would be just, I mean, because that's what Disneyland is, right? Yeah. That's what meeting Disney princesses.
I know that you're teaching drag now as a professor, and I'm curious what that's been like to teach it to students, and also to be teaching it in this moment.
So it's, whenever I get to teach this class called Critical Drag, it's the most fun. It's a class in which students seem to take ownership over the whole class itself, because they are making a show together. They are giving each other feedback on what they do and what they want drag to be. So I give them as much structure as I can, but then there's the kind of freedom they have over how they want to do gender. but it's an opportunity for them to realize that actually doing gender is about making a lot of choices, and it requires thinking about race and religion and language at the same time that they're thinking about gender, that all of these things are in fact deeply intertwined. And so because it's both kind of cultural studies class as well as a performance-based class, I think there's just a lot of experiential learning. And so they experience a lot of frustration because they're like, oh, I didn't like the choice I made, or I don't have enough time to make the outfit I want, and it's also learning about compromise. It's about a kind of strategic choice making. It's about learning about the drag industry, and that how drag kings and queens and artists have a variety of hacks for making things cheaper, because again, gender is really expensive. It's from electrolysis to surgeries to all of these things can be really expensive, but a corset or a skin-colored glove can do wonders to create the illusion of this or that, right? A well-placed sock can create a bulge where you want it, right? So there are all these like hacks that I think are really fun for them to learn about, and it reminds them that gender can be playful. It isn't just a restrictive device that is oppressive. But then that's what makes it dangerous to others, is that it reminds them that the binary is nonsense, right?
Right.
The binary is one to inhabit only on your own terms and not because a government says you should, right? Yeah, and I think that that's really important, that like people get to a room where they get make choices about gender. But you asked what it's like to teach it now. The shooting at Club Q happened while I was teaching the class the last time, and it's really, it just is a reminder that it's always scary to be in these queer collective spaces, that they are doing risky work, and that putting gender on the body is risk. It is in fact bringing yourself into a form of surveillance of what is proper and good and what is not. And I think they feel that. So there's a lot of liberation that happens of like being, oh, I don't have to do this. Drag doesn't have to be this one way. It can be a lot of things. I don't have to do gender this way. I can do it another way. But then they also realize, oh, that comes with risk as well. And I think that's really hard. I think that it's exhausting. And I hope that the fun we have in the classroom becomes an important sort of complement to the exhaustion.
So then, what keeps you going? What supports your heart? And what gives you joy? And what gives you hope?
There are all these things that other people do that I can't do. Like, there are all these queer and trans folks who are working in legislation and who are writing the language for these cases that I see them on the news, like actually talking about policy, and I'm like, wow, you're amazing, right? It's so I can do this kind of cultural work, but that there are actually people out there doing policy work, I think is so sexy and incredible, and I love seeing that, right? I like knowing that there are people doing that work, because it does keep us safe, right? It does have long-term impact. I don't know enough about freedom of speech and privacy acts and whatnot to be able to teach that to people. And I'm glad that there are people who can educate us and keep us abreast with what's at stake and what the possibilities are. So that's one. The other is, the thing that keeps me going is going to drag shows. For all these critiques of what drag does, you go to a show and drag is it's just pure magic. I never go to a show and leave with disappointment or sadness, or it is really fully life-giving. And it's so shocking that the rhetoric around it is that it's dangerous and something to worry about, because it is in fact the greatest. So that's something, I do regularly, is go to drag shows, because they do in fact give me life. I don't perform that often. I'm not a kind of like weekly entertainer, but I go weekly if I can, because I just think that they're really special spaces. They're really invigorating and beautiful and joyful and messy, and I love that.
For sure. Beautiful. I agree. I think one of the saddest things about the pandemic was that nightlife everywhere came to a screeching halt. And then after the pandemic, we were out in a quieter part of the state. Yeah. And there wasn't nearly as much going on there. Certainly not the kinds of queer drag and queer color drag and burlesque that happens semi-regularly in Boston.
But it's actually interesting to me that these places where drag is being so heavily regulated have huge drag scenes.
They do.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's
exactly.
another thing to acknowledge, is that like drag is in the Midwest and the South, and it's in rural areas, and it's in all these places that quote unquote seem conservative because of the laws being enacted are actually thriving drag communities. And I hope they survive, right? They survived and have grown since pandemic shutdowns have reopened up, and it speaks to their resilience. And I hope that resilience holds through all of this as well.
And I mean, drag shows in those places, they must be fun.
Oh, they're amazing. Amazing.
I remember there was a performance that we were at, and you had somebody come up and join you. You were performing as LaWhore, and you asked her how your beard looked. And she said, "What beard?" And you said, "Excellent. I've done my work well." And ever since that day, I've been so curious. Kareem, how?
How what?
How do you cover up the beard?
Oh my God, I don't even remember that. It's several layers of foundation, but it's specifically, I mean, this is why drag is art, but like there's color correction. So you put down like a orange layer that cuts out the blue of the beard, and then you put foundation over that. But it's like, there's like real physics and color theory happening to transform the face, right? It's actually amazing. The things that I've learned, I'm like, it's, and I mean, there's like physics and chemistry happening when people are styling hair as well, and use, what products to use and how to stick things to your body. And it's, I mean, the artistry and the engineering is just next level.
It is. Yeah.
And I engage only in like a fraction of what I think some other performers do.
Amazing. Thank you. That's been a curiosity I've had for like 6 years. So thank you for indulging me. That's great. So what are you up to now that's exciting to you?
So I have a fellowship to go back to school for a year. And so I'm going to go to New York, and I'm going to go study fashion. This is one part of drag where I'm just not great at. I don't sew well. I'm still struggling to understand like how to do my aesthetic right in drag. I know a lot about like my boy clothes or my everyday clothes, or whatever you want to call them. But when it comes to drag, I don't know how to be resourceful. I don't know how to think about it in inefficient ways about how I dress. So I'm just excited to learn. And I think someone who's been in the academy since 2008, I love learning, right? I've been in higher education since 2008. I love learning, and teach, and I think I can learn a lot about teaching by taking classes again. So I'm gonna go learn about that and be a student and ask questions and raise my hand. And I just think that that's gonna be a really great chance for me to refresh, to be humble, to fill myself up, as opposed to giving of myself a lot.
Love that. Amazing. Well, Kareem, thank you so much for your time and for coming on here and talking to me.
Of course, it's been great. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You can find Kareem and LaWhore on Instagram and Twitter using @KareemPuff and @LaWhore Vagistan, and learn more about critical auntie studies on Instagram @Ontologies. Links in the show notes. Be sure to follow us on Instagram @QueerEverythingPodcast or check out our website at www.queereverything.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.